Ambassador Zektar of the Veltari Empire stared at the holographic display with all four of his eyes, each one blinking in sequence as he processed what he was seeing. The data made no sense, according to everything he understood about galactic law and the sacred protocols that had governed interspecies relations for over 10,000 years. Computer, verify this information again, he commanded in his species' characteristic clicking tongue. The artificial intelligence responded immediately. Verification complete. All data is accurate. Species designation: humans. Origin: Sol system, third planet. Status: admitted to Galactic Council without standard consent protocols. Date of admission: Galactic Standard Year 4127. No objections recorded. No voting process initiated. Zektar's mandibles clicked in agitation. In his 3 centuries of diplomatic service, he had never encountered such an anomaly. Every single species that had ever joined the Galactic Council had required unanimous consent from all existing members. The process was sacred, unchangeable, and absolute. The Velthari themselves had waited 47 years for approval, enduring rigorous testing, cultural evaluation, and technological assessment, before the 847 member species finally agreed to their admission. Yet here was a species called humans, who had simply been granted entry without any recorded deliberation whatsoever. Display the admission records for comparative analysis, Zektar ordered. Holographic documents materialized around his desk, showing the standard admission process. First came the petition of intent, where a species formally requested consideration. Then followed the year of observation, during which Council scouts would study the applicant species' society, technology, and intentions. Next was the Tribunal of Questions, where representatives would answer detailed inquiries about their civilization's goals and methods. Finally came the Great Deliberation, where all member species would debate and vote. The process was lengthy, thorough, and had never been bypassed. Until now. Zektar pulled up the human records again. No petition of intent. No year of observation. No Tribunal of Questions. No Great Deliberation. Instead, there was simply a single entry. Species humans granted immediate full membership by primordial authority. All standard protocols superseded. Primordial authority? Zektar whispered. He had never heard that term before, not in all his years of studying galactic law and history. The door to his office chimed, and his aide, Yilen, scuttled in on her 6 legs. Ambassador, the council session is about to begin. The humans are presenting their proposal for the disputed mining rights in the Kepler sector. Humans again, Zektar muttered. These newcomers seem to be involved in every major decision lately. Despite having been council members for less than 50 standard years, most species spent their first century simply observing and learning protocols. Yilen, in your research duties, have you ever encountered the term primordial authority? His aide's antennae twitched thoughtfully. I believe I have seen references in the most ancient archives, Ambassador. Something about the first builders, the ones who created the original council structures, but those records are mostly myths and legends now. Zektar gathered his materials and headed toward the council chambers, his mind still wrestling with the mystery. As they walked through the vast corridors of the council station, passing representatives from hundreds of different worlds and species, he found himself studying each delegation they encountered. There were the crystalline Siltharians, whose silicon-based physiology made them natural miners and engineers. The gas-dwelling Airkoth floated in their containment suits, their plasma-based consciousness flickering with thought. Towering above most others were the Gorthak, descendants of ancient warriors who had turned their strength to peacekeeping duties. Each species had their specialization, their role in the grand tapestry of galactic civilization. Each had earned their place through centuries of proving their worth and commitment to council principles. Then there were the humans. As Zektar entered the main chamber, he spotted the human delegation immediately. They were unremarkable in many ways. Bipedal, carbon-based, average height and build, no natural armor like the Gorthok, No advanced sensory organs like his own people. No energy manipulation abilities like the Arakoth. Yet something about their presence commanded attention. The lead human representative, a female called Ambassador Chen, stepped up to the speaking platform. "Honored counselors," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. "We come before you today not just as advocates for mining rights, but as guardians of a principle that affects us all." Zektar leaned forward, interested despite himself. The human's tone carried an unusual quality. Not the formal detachment most species employed, but something warmer, more personal. "The Kepler sector contains not just valuable minerals," Ambassador Chen continued, "but the ruins of an ancient civilization. The Tolvec people once called those worlds home. They're gone now, extinct for 2 millennia. But their legacy remains in the cities they built, the art they created, the stories carved into stone." A murmur went through the chamber. The Tolvec were indeed extinct, but their former territories had been declared fair game for resource extraction under Council Law 4847. Any species could claim mining rights to dead worlds after a waiting period. "We propose," Chen said, her eyes seeming to meet those of every representative in the vast chamber, "that we establish the Kepler sector as a protected memorial zone. Not for profit, not for exploitation, but as a reminder that every species, even those lost to time, deserves to be remembered." The chamber erupted in discussion. Such a proposal was unprecedented. The economic value of the Kepler sector was enormous. To set it aside for purely memorial purposes went against thousands of years of practical resource management. Zektar watched as species after species rose to speak. The Merganthi Trade Confederation argued the economic foolishness. The Zarketh Mining Guild protested the precedent it would set. The Velthari Empire's own representatives spoke of resource scarcity and practical needs, yet something strange was happening. As the debate continued, Zektar noticed that opinions were shifting. Species that had initially seemed opposed began voicing support for the human proposal, not because of logical arguments or economic incentives, but because of something else entirely. The humans weren't just presenting facts and figures, they were telling stories. Ambassador Chen spoke of Tolvec children whose drawings had been found in the ruins, still bright with colors that had lasted 2,000 years. Her colleague, Ambassador Williams, described the poetry found carved into temple walls, verses about love and hope and dreams that transcended species barriers. Another human delegate, Dr. Rodriguez, displayed holographic reconstructions of Tolvec families, created from archaeological evidence. "They loved their children," she said simply. "They watched sunsets. They wondered about the stars. In the end, isn't that what we all do?" Zektar felt something unfamiliar stirring in his consciousness, an emotional response that his analytical Velthari mind found disturbing. He wasn't alone. Around the chamber, representatives from hundreds of species were visibly affected by the human presentation. This wasn't normal council procedure. Decisions were supposed to be based on practical considerations, cost-benefit analysis, and legal precedent. Yet the humans had somehow transformed a simple resource allocation debate into something deeper, something that reached past species differences and touched universal experiences. When the vote was called, Zektar found himself raising his delegation's support indicator before he fully realized what he was doing. Around the chamber, species after species did the same. The final tally was unprecedented. 99.7% in favor of the human proposal. As the session ended and species began filing out, Zektar remained in his seat, shaken. In 3 centuries of diplomatic service, he had never seen anything like what had just happened. The humans had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had made 800 different species think and feel as one. "Remarkable, isn't it?" a voice said beside him. Zektar turned to see an ancient being he didn't recognize, humanoid but clearly very old, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer with its own light. The creature's eyes held depths that suggested vast age and knowledge. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met," Zektar said, though he knew every species represented on the council. "My name is Keeper Siloth," the being replied. Let's say, I'm an observer. I've been watching today's proceedings with great interest." "The human proposal was certainly unusual," Zektar admitted. "I'm still not entirely sure how they managed to convince so many species to vote against their own economic interests." Keeper Siloth's expression grew thoughtful. "Ambassador Zektar, may I ask what you know about the founding of the Galactic Council?" "The standard history," Zektar replied. 10,000 years ago, the first builders created the council structure to prevent the kind of galactic wars that had devastated entire star systems. They established the sacred protocols to ensure that only species capable of peaceful cooperation could join. And what became of these first builders? Zektar's mandibles clicked uncertainty. "The records aren't clear. They seem to have vanished from galactic history after establishing the council. Most scholars believe they ascended to a higher plane of existence, or simply died out." Keeper Siloth nodded slowly. "Tell me, Ambassador, have you ever wondered why the sacred protocols exist at all? Why the requirement for unanimous consent to join the council? To ensure stability and prevent conflict," Zektar answered automatically. "But why unanimous consent specifically? Why not majority rule? Or supermajority? Or any of a dozen other systems that would be more efficient?" Zektar had never really questioned this before. I suppose because the founders believed that true cooperation required complete agreement." "Close," Siloth said, "but not quite complete. The truth is more complex, and more remarkable than you might imagine." The ancient being looked around the now empty chamber, his silver eyes reflecting something that might have been sadness, or perhaps hope. "The sacred protocols weren't created to keep species out of the council, Ambassador. They were created to keep one very specific species from joining until the galaxy was ready for them. The unanimous consent requirement exists because the first builders knew that when that species finally appeared, their very presence would change everything." "What species?" Zektar asked, though somewhere in his analytical mind, he was beginning to suspect. "A species that doesn't just think with logic, or feel with emotion, but does both simultaneously. A species that can look at a mathematical problem and see poetry, or observe a sunset and derive scientific principles. A species that makes decisions not just with their minds or their hearts, but with something that bridges both." Siloth turned to face Zektar directly. "A species that can take 800 different civilizations and help them remember that beneath all the differences, biological, technological, cultural, there are experiences that unite every sentient being who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered." The implications hit Zektar like a physical blow. "You're saying the humans are the species the first builders were waiting for," Siloth confirmed. "The ones who could finally unite the galaxy, not through conquest or coercion, but through the simple act of helping others remember their shared humanity." Zektar's worldview shifted fundamentally in that moment. Everything he thought he knew about galactic law, about the Council's purpose, about the nature of interspecies relations, suddenly needed to be reconsidered. "But why now?" he asked. "Why didn't the humans appear centuries ago?" "Why? Because," Keeper Siloth said, beginning to fade as if he had never been fully there in the first place, "the galaxy wasn't ready for them until now. It took 10,000 years of careful development, of species learning to cooperate despite their differences, before the foundation was strong enough to support what the humans represent." "Wait," Zektar called out. But the ancient being was already gone, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air. Ambassador Zektar sat alone in the empty council chamber, processing what he had learned. Outside the great windows, ships from hundreds of different worlds moved in careful patterns around the station, a dance of cooperation that had taken millennia to perfect. 3 months had passed since Ambassador Zektar's strange encounter with Keeper Siloth, and the Velthari diplomat found himself studying human behavior with unprecedented interest. Every council session, every diplomatic gathering, every casual interaction seemed to reveal new layers to these remarkable beings. Today, however, was different. Today brought crisis. The emergency alert pierced through the council station's normal atmosphere of measured deliberation. Red warnings flashed across every display, and the automated voice system announced in the common tongue, "Priority Alpha Emergency. All representatives report to Emergency Assembly Chamber 7 immediately." Zektar rushed through corridors filled with confused and worried beings from across the galaxy. Emergency Assembly Chamber 7 was reserved for the most serious threats to galactic stability. It had been used only 12 times in the past 1,000 years. As he entered the vast chamber, Zektar saw that nearly every council species had already arrived. The central platform displayed a massive holographic star map. With one sector pulsing an ominous red, High Chancellor Mordak of the Zentori hegemony stood at the podium, his usually composed crystalline features showing obvious stress. "Councilors," he began, his voice carrying the weight of impending disaster, "we face an unprecedented threat. The Void Plague has returned." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. The Void Plague was the stuff of nightmares. A cosmic phenomenon that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization 5,000 years ago. It was entropy given form. A spreading zone of nothingness that consumed entire star systems, leaving behind not even the basic matter that composed space itself. Our deepest space monitoring stations detected the first signs 18 hours ago, Chancellor Mordak continued. The plague has emerged in the outer rim, in the Solus sector. Initial projections indicate it will reach inhabited systems within 6 standard months. The hologram zoomed in on the affected area. Where star systems should have been, there was simply nothing. Not darkness, not empty space, but an absence so complete it hurt to perceive. Previous historical records indicate that the Void Plague cannot be stopped by conventional means, the Chancellor continued. Military force is useless against nothingness. Technological barriers simply cease to exist when the plague reaches them. 5 millennia ago, our ancestors could only evacuate threatened areas and pray that the phenomenon would burn itself out. Species representatives throughout the chamber began speaking at once, their various languages creating a cacophony of fear and confusion. Some demanded immediate evacuation protocols. Others called for the deployment of experimental weapons. A few suggested attempting to negotiate with whatever force might be driving the plague. Through it all, Zektar noticed that the human delegation remained strangely quiet. Ambassador Chen sat with her colleagues, their faces serious, but not panicked. They seemed to be listening to everything, processing the information, but not adding to the chaos of proposed solutions. "Order," Chancellor Mordak called out. "We must approach this systematically. The Emergency Protocol Council will review all proposed responses, and—" "Chancellor," a calm voice interrupted. Ambassador Chen had risen from her seat. "With respect, we may not have time for extended deliberation." "Ambassador Chen," the Chancellor replied stiffly, "while we appreciate human enthusiasm, this is a matter requiring the careful consideration of species with millennia of experience dealing with cosmic threats." Chen's expression didn't change, but Zektar noticed something in her eyes. Not anger at the dismissal, but something that looked almost like pity. "Chancellor, with all due respect to the accumulated wisdom in this chamber, I believe we're approaching this problem incorrectly. And what would humans, with less than 50 years of council membership, suggest?" This came from Ambassador Yargeth of the Mordun Collective, one of the oldest and most traditional species in the galaxy. Chen looked around the chamber, making eye contact with representatives from dozens of species. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the translation systems. But there was something in her tone that transcended mere words. "We suggest," she said quietly, "that we stop trying to fight the Void Plague and start trying to understand it." The chamber erupted in protests. Fight the Void Plague? No one fought the Void Plague. It was like trying to fight the concept of non-existence itself. Ambassador Williams, Chen's colleague, stood up beside her. 5,000 years ago, when the plague first appeared, what ended it? According to the historical records I've reviewed, it simply stopped. No explanation given. No theory advanced. It just ceased expanding, and eventually contracted back into nothingness. "What's your point?" Chancellor Mordak demanded. "My point," Williams replied, "is that something made it stop. And that something wasn't military action or technological barriers. It was something else entirely." Dr. Rodriguez, the third member of the human delegation, activated her personal holographic display. Data began flowing around her, not the usual technical readouts that species typically presented, but something different. Musical notations, artistic patterns, psychological profiles, philosophical texts. "We've been studying the historical records from a different angle," she explained. "Not just what happened, but how the galaxy responded emotionally to the crisis. And we found something interesting." The data reformed into a timeline showing the last weeks of the previous void plague. "Look at the communications records from that period," Rodriguez continued. "As the plague advanced and species faced the possibility of complete extinction, something changed in how they interacted with each other." The hologram showed message logs from across the galaxy. At first, they were standard evacuation notices and technical reports. But as the crisis deepened, the messages became more personal. Species that had been formal allies began sending cultural exchanges. Ancient enemies shared poetry and music. Civilizations that had never spoken to each other reached across the void to say, "We see you. You matter. You will be remembered." In the final days before the plague inexplicably stopped, Rodriguez said, "The entire galaxy was united in a way it had never been before or since. Not united in action. There was nothing anyone could do. United in recognition of shared existence, shared consciousness, shared meaning." "You're suggesting," Zektar said slowly, "that the void plague stopped because of emotion? Sentiment?" "Not emotion," Chen corrected gently. "Connection. The void plague is entropy, the absence of meaning and relationship. But consciousness, the very fact that beings can think, feel, create, hope, is the opposite of entropy. It's the force that creates meaning from chaos." "This is absurd," Ambassador Yargith protested. "You're talking about cosmic forces, not feelings." "Are they different?" Chen asked. "Every civilization in this chamber represents billions of beings who chose to create rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down, to reach for the stars despite the vast emptiness between them. That's not just sentiment. That's the fundamental force that drives the universe toward complexity and meaning." Ambassador Williams stepped forward. "We're not suggesting that positive thinking will defeat the void plague. We're suggesting that the plague might be a natural balancing force, something that appears when the galaxy becomes too focused on individual gain and loses sight of universal connection." "And if you're wrong?" Chancellor Mordak asked bluntly. "Then we die as we lived," Chen replied simply. "As conscious beings who chose to see meaning in existence instead of surrendering to the void." The chamber fell silent. The concept was so alien to traditional galactic thinking that most species seemed unable to process it. Military force, technological solutions, practical evacuations, these made sense. But the idea that consciousness itself might be a cosmic force was beyond their experience. Zektar stood up. "What exactly are you proposing we do?" We're proposing an experiment," Chen said. "Instead of evacuating threatened systems, we gather there. Instead of each species fleeing separately, we come together. We share our stories, our cultures, our dreams. We consciously celebrate the incredible diversity of consciousness that exists in our galaxy." "You want us to fly directly toward the void plague?" Yargith was aghast. "We want you to fly toward each other," Rodriguez corrected. "The plague isn't our enemy. It's a symptom. The real enemy is the disconnection, the individualism, the tendency for species to see themselves as separate from the greater tapestry of galactic consciousness." End quote. "This is madness," declared the Chancellor. "Madness," Ambassador Chen agreed, "by the standards of the last 5,000 years. But those standards have led us to a galaxy where species compete for resources, maintain separate territories, and interact through formal protocols that maintain distance even in cooperation. She looked around the chamber again, and Zektar felt that strange stirring of connection he had experienced during the Kepler sector debate. The first builders, Chen continued, understood something we've forgotten. They didn't create the council to manage separate civilizations. They created it to nurture the emergence of a truly galactic consciousness, a state where every sentient being could recognize their fundamental connection to every other conscious entity in the universe. And you believe humans can facilitate this? Zektar asked. Not just humans, Chen replied. All of us, together. Humans might have certain, let's call them translation abilities, that make connection easier, but consciousness itself, the force that creates meaning from chaos, exists in every being capable of thought and choice. The debate continued for hours. Species after species raised objections, concerns, and alternative proposals. Yet gradually, Zektar noticed the same phenomenon he had witnessed during the Kepler sector vote. Opinions were shifting, not because of logical arguments, but because of something deeper. The humans weren't just proposing a strategy, they were demonstrating it. Every question was answered with respect for the questioner. Every objection was met with understanding rather than defensiveness. Every fear was acknowledged rather than dismissed. Slowly, impossibly, a consensus began to emerge. Very well, Chancellor Mordak finally said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. If we're going to attempt this experiment, how do we proceed? Ambassador Chen smiled, and for a moment, the entire chamber seemed brighter. We start by admitting that we're all afraid, she said. And that it's okay to be afraid. Fear is what consciousness feels when it recognizes the possibility of its own ending. But courage is what consciousness does when it chooses to connect with others despite that fear. We begin, Ambassador Williams added, by sharing something true about ourselves with someone different from us. Not data. Not protocols. Not formal statements. Something real. Something that matters. Dr. Rodriguez nodded, and then we listen. Really listen. Not to formulate responses or find flaws, but to understand what it means to exist as a conscious being in a vast universe. The fleet departs for the Solis sector in 72 hours, Chen concluded. Anyone who chooses to join us will be welcome. Anyone who chooses to evacuate will be helped to do so. But we believe, we hope, that enough of us will choose connection over separation to make a difference. As the emergency session ended and species began filing out, Zektar remained in his seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just been proposed. They were going to fly directly toward annihilation, armed with nothing but the hope that consciousness itself could stand against the void. And somehow, inexplicably, it felt like the most rational thing anyone had proposed in centuries. And now, apparently, it was time for the next movement in that cosmic ballet. To begin, the massive fleet that assembled at the edge of the Solis sector was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Instead of the usual military formations or orderly evacuation convoys, nearly 300 ships from over 60 species hung in space together, their different designs and technologies creating a chaotic but beautiful tapestry against the stars. Ambassador Zektar stood on the observation deck of the human vessel Times Unity *, watching as crystalline hierarchs shared mathematical poetry with gaseous collectives, while aquatic federations demonstrated their bioluminescent art forms to silicon-based mining guilds. The ship itself was a marvel. Not just because of its technology, but because of how it had been designed to accommodate the needs of dozens of different species simultaneously. It's working, Ambassador Chen said quietly, joining him at the viewport. Look at them. Zektar followed her gaze and saw something that defied his understanding of interspecies relations. A group of young Gorthak warriors, whose species prided itself on emotional control, were weeping openly as they listened to Velthari mathematical harmonies. Nearby, the notoriously logical Zentori had formed a circle with the equally analytical Mirganthi. But instead of discussing trade agreements or technological specifications, they were sharing childhood memories. How is this possible? Zektar asked. These species have maintained formal relations for centuries, but I've never seen them connect like this. Because they've never been invited to, Chen replied. Everything about our normal diplomatic structures is designed to maintain distance, to treat species as separate entities that happen to cooperate. We've never actually tried to help them recognize their fundamental similarities. A soft chime indicated that they were approaching the boundary of the void plague zone. Zektar turned toward the main display and felt his breathing apparatus constrict with instinctive fear. The edge of the plague was visible now, not as darkness, but as a wrongness that made his optical organs hurt to perceive directly. "Ship's report ready," came the voice of Captain Morrison, the Times, Unity Asterisks commanding officer. "All species representatives confirm willingness to proceed." "Then let's go meet the void," Chen said simply. As the fleet crossed into the plague zone, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the usual chatter of military communications or technical reports, the communication channels filled with something else entirely. Music from a dozen different species began to blend together. Mathematical proofs became poetry. Scientific observations turned into philosophical meditations on the nature of existence. "Ambassador." Captain Morrison's voice carried a note of wonder. "You need to see this." On the main display, the leading edge of the void plague was visible, that terrible absence that consumed matter and energy alike. But something was wrong with the readings. The plague's expansion had slowed dramatically. "It's responding to us," Dr. Rodriguez said from her station. Surrounded by displays showing consciousness patterns, brainwave harmonics, and something she called empathy resonance frequencies. The plague isn't just random entropy. It's some kind of balancing mechanism. When galactic consciousness becomes too fragmented, too focused on separation, the plague emerges to reset the balance. "You mean it's intelligent?" Zektar asked. "Not intelligent," Chen corrected. "More like inevitable. Like gravity. Or thermodynamics. A fundamental force that maintains cosmic balance." Ambassador Williams approached the group, his face bright with excitement. "We're receiving signals from the evacuated systems, the ones the plague consumed weeks ago. They're not gone. They're somewhere else. Somewhere outside normal space-time." "What kind of signals?" Chen asked. "Listen," Williams said, activating the audio feed. What emerged from the speakers was unlike anything Zektar had ever heard. It was music. But not from any single species. It was mathematics, but expressed in ways that transcended numerical systems. It was pure communication. Consciousness, speaking to consciousness, without the barriers of language or physical form. The consumed systems, Williams explained, they're not destroyed. They're translated, moved to a state of existence where consciousness can exist without the limitations of physical matter. "But that means," Zektar began. "That means," Chen finished, "that the void plague isn't destroying consciousness. It's offering an alternative. A way for civilizations to exist as pure awareness, instead of being bound to physical forms." Dr. Rodriguez looked up from her displays. "The question is, why? Why would a cosmic force offer such a choice? And why now?" The answer came from an unexpected source. As the fleet moved deeper into the plague zone, space around them began to shimmer, and familiar figures materialized on the Times Unity Asterisks bridge. Keeper Siloth appeared first, followed by others, beings of impossible age and wisdom that seemed to be made of starlight itself. "Because," Siloth said, his voice carrying harmonics that touched every consciousness present, "the galaxy has reached a critical threshold. For 10,000 years, species have been growing, learning, evolving toward true unity. You are ready now for the choice that faces every mature galactic civilization." "What choice?" Chen asked, though Zektar suspected she already knew. "The choice between physical evolution and consciousness evolution," another of the ancient beings replied. "Every galactic civilization eventually reaches this point, the moment when their collective consciousness becomes sophisticated enough to exist independently of physical form. You're the first builders," Zektar realized. "You didn't disappear. You chose consciousness. Evolution. We did, Siloth confirmed. But not all of us. Some remained in physical form to guide the galaxy toward this moment, to prepare the various species for their own choice. The humans, Chen said. It wasn't a question. Not exactly, Silith smiled. Humans are the descendants of those first builders who chose to remain physical, but they've evolved far beyond their original forms. They carry within their consciousness the ability to bridge the gap between physical and pure awareness existence. The truth was staggering. Humans weren't just another species. They were the evolved descendants of the galaxy's original architects, shaped by millennia of guiding other civilizations toward consciousness unity. That's why you were granted entry without consent, Zektar said to Chen. You weren't joining the council. You were returning home. In a sense, Chen replied. But more importantly, we were fulfilling our purpose. The sacred protocols weren't created to keep species out. They were created to ensure that when the time came for this choice, the galaxy would be ready to make it together, as a unified consciousness. The void plague had stopped expanding entirely now. In fact, it was beginning to contract, responding to the harmony of consciousness that the gathered fleet represented. So what happens now? Zektar asked. Now, Dr. Rodriguez said, each species chooses. Those ready for consciousness evolution can accept translation to pure awareness existence. Those who prefer to remain physical can continue in this reality. And some will choose to bridge both states, Ambassador Williams finished, like humans have been doing for millennia, existing partially in physical form and partially as pure consciousness, helping to maintain the connection between the two states of being. Around the fleet, something miraculous was happening. The space that the void plague had consumed was returning, but transformed. Star systems reappeared. But they were different now. Places where consciousness and matter existed in perfect harmony, where beings could choose their level of physical manifestation based on their needs and desires. The evacuated populations, Siloth explained, experienced a preview of consciousness evolution. They can return to physical form if they choose, or remain as pure awareness, or move freely between states. And the Galaxy Council? Zektar asked. Will continue, Chen replied, but with a deeper understanding of its true purpose. Not just to govern separate species, but to nurture the ongoing evolution of galactic consciousness toward ever greater unity and complexity. The ancient being who had spoken earlier stepped forward. The experiment is complete. The galaxy has proven itself capable of choosing unity over separation, connection over isolation, even when facing apparent annihilation. You are ready to join the greater cosmic community. Greater cosmic community? Zektar's mind reeled. The universe contains many galaxies, Siloth explained, each eventually reaching this same threshold. Those that choose unity become part of an ever-expanding network of cosmic consciousness. Those that choose separation, eventually, well, they create their own voids. As the ancient beings began to fade, Siloth turned to the human delegation. Your phase of guidance is complete. Humanity can now choose its own path, remain as bridges, evolve to pure consciousness, or something entirely new. We choose, Ambassador Chen said without hesitation, to remain as bridges. For as long as there are conscious beings who need help remembering their connection to each other, that's where humans want to be. The ancient beings smiled and vanished, leaving the fleet surrounded by a transformed galaxy. Where the void plague had been, there was now something that could only be described as possibility itself. Space where consciousness could manifest in any form it chose. Over the following months, as news of what had happened spread throughout the galaxy, the changes were profound. The Galaxy Council restructured itself as a consciousness collective rather than a political entity. Species barriers became fluid, with beings choosing their level of physical manifestation based on their current needs and desires. Some civilizations chose full consciousness, evolution, becoming beings of pure awareness who could communicate directly mind to mind. Others preferred to remain fully physical, but now understood their deep connection to all other conscious entities. Most chose something in between, maintaining physical forms but with enhanced awareness of their place in the greater tapestry of galactic consciousness. And at the center of it all, facilitating every transition and helping to maintain connections across all states of being, were the humans. No longer mysterious newcomers with inexplicable privileges. They were recognized for what they had always been. The galaxy's guides toward unity. The bridges between different states of consciousness. The living proof that evolution's highest achievement wasn't individual perfection, but the recognition of universal connection. Ambassador Zektar, who had chosen enhanced physical existence with expanded consciousness awareness, found himself working closely with the human delegation to help other species navigate their own choices. In quiet moments, he often reflected on that first day when he had discovered the anomaly in human admission records. "Did you know?" he asked Ambassador Chen one day, as they watched a group of newly evolved consciousness entities teaching traditional physical species about non-linear communication. "When you first came to the council, did you know what humans really were?" Chen smiled. That same expression that had somehow managed to unite 800 different species in a single moment of shared understanding. "We knew we were different," she said. "We knew we saw connections where others saw separations. But understanding our full purpose? That took time." "Well, and now? Now we know that consciousness isn't something individuals possess," Chen replied. "It's something we all share. A universal phenomenon that expresses itself through countless different forms. Our job isn't to be special or superior. Our job is to help everyone remember that they're all part of the same magnificent, ever-evolving cosmic mind." Looking around at the transformed galaxy, where beings of pure thought worked alongside physical entities, where species barriers had become fluid choices rather than rigid divisions, where the very fabric of space had been reshaped to accommodate infinite forms of consciousness, Zektar understood finally why humans had been granted entry without consent. They hadn't needed permission to join the Galaxy Council because they had never really left it. They were the Council's original architects, evolved and transformed by millennia of service, but still fundamentally dedicated to their founding purpose, helping conscious beings throughout the galaxy remember that beneath all their differences, they were part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than any individual could achieve alone. The void plague was gone, but its lesson remained. Consciousness was the universe's greatest achievement, and unity was consciousness's greatest expression, and humanity, in all its evolved complexity, existed to help that truth spread from galaxy to galaxy, consciousness to consciousness, throughout the infinite expanse of cosmic time and space. N.